Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host today, and I'm also the creator and the moderator of thechocolatelife.com. I want to remind everybody who's watching, go into the comments, whether you're watching on LinkedIn or Facebook, or the live chat if you're watching on YouTube, and let me know where in the world you are connecting from. Not the platform, not LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook, but physically where in the world you're connecting from. And you can also go into the comments and ask questions. And I'll give the shout outs and the questions up on the screen and in recognition, and try to answer everything today. And so what I want to do is just jump right into it today. It's a jam-packed topic that I think will be really, really interesting for everyone. I'm hoping it will be. It's certainly a topic that's been fascinating for me since the very earliest days of my working as a chocolate critic, which is, the first thing I need to do as a chocolate critic is to figure out what I'm tasting, right? And then the second thing I need to do is to figure out how to articulate to others what it is that I am tasting. And so since the very beginning of my career, I started doing, the formal research in this back in 1996 or thereabouts. This has been a lifelong journey and a lifelong obsession. This is something that I've needed to be able to do, and I've been constantly learning and constantly refining and constantly thinking about lots of different approaches. And so, one of the things you may want to ask yourself today, and something you may want to share with me, is what worked for you. What is your favorite approach? What have you found to work, and what have you found not to work? So we can get into those discussions today. All right, with that, what I want to say is this is the homepage of the Chocolate Life right now. You can go there. It's exactly as you see it. And this episode of Pod Save Chocolate is sponsored by all of the members of thechocolatelife.com. If you're not a member, you can go. You can click on this green button here. I'm logged in, so it says account. If you're not logged in, it'll say join. There's always a free membership. No spam. No, I'm not doing Patreon. I'm not doing ads or anything like that. If you do have the resources to be able to support the work I'm doing, then go ahead and get a premium membership. I would certainly appreciate that. And for every single episode of Pod Safe Chocolate, I put together a post. And here is the post for today's episode. And you can go through, and I'm going to be presenting the resource links and images and other things that are on this page during the course of today's episode. And what you'll do is you'll have an opportunity to follow along here on screen. Sometimes it's difficult to see what it is that is written, but the idea is that if you can follow along while I'm doing this, on another screen or another computer or another device, you can do that. But you can always go back, right, and be able to look at these full-sized images after the fact and get an idea of what it is. Not get an idea. You'll be able to, view and take a look at it much more considered, time to be able to review what's going on. So I think it's really important to be able to say that. And so what I want to start off with today is, first of all, it's a topic I was asked to give a talk at New York University to a department in the chemistry department. There was a group, a food science collective, and they asked me to give a talk on how chocolate gets its taste. And this is a long time ago. I'm talking, at least 15 years ago. I'm thinking around that time. But in any event, what I wanted to do is I wanted to come up with a quick formula, and that formula is here. A quick formula. I'm here. I can make it a little larger. A quick formula that talks about how chocolate gets its taste, right? And so F, the flavor or the taste of chocolate, consists of a number of things. The terroir, and so terroir is generally considered to be the environment in which the trees grow, or the crop grows. So the terroir is for grapes is going to be the soil, it's going to be sunshine, it's going to be the weather, and other things. And so there is the long-term climate generally, right, and then weather, which is year to year, and then you have so that terroir is modified by, so that's what this symbol here is modified, or actually this is the mathematical symbol for modulus arithmetic, but it's modified, right? But what I call local agricultural and post-harvest processes. So there may be specific ways in an area where there are specific agricultural practices that take place on the farm, and so the terroir, right, terroir is the first aspect of things, and then the terroir gets modified by, how are the trees pruned, how are they planted, are they fertilized, what kind of fertilizer is used, how are they watered, is there additional drip irrigation with pruning, do I leave all of the cuttings on the ground, do I remove the cuttings from the farm and do something with it? So these are going to be the agricultural practices, and then these are also modified by the post-harvest practices. And so those post-harvest practices are, fermentation and drying, right? But there are also things that people do like pre-fermentation, and then they will perhaps allow some reduction of the pulp and juice. For example, for CCN 51, there's so much juice and it is so sweet that if you don't centrifuge or otherwise remove some of the juice from the CCN 51, you can easily, it gets too hot too quickly and over ferment it, thereby damaging the CCN 51. And that's one of the reasons why CCN 51 had such a bad rap for so many years. It was just improperly fermented, right? And so you have the genetics, right? And I'm going to put that in there. I'm going to do this. Genetics represents the potential. That potential of the genetics is modified by the terroir, and then the terroir is also modified by the agricultural practices and the post-harvest practices. And in my thinking about this, there are a lot of ways in which there are a lot of places in the world where there are very specific agricultural and post-harvest practices. And what I would do is I would lump those into terroir, because they're an inescapable part of it. And so we think, for example, of a denomination like Champagne, a denomination like Champagne. It is a specific variety or specific varieties of grapes. It is a specific location and is a specific manufacturing method. And those all get lumped together, right, in a sort of a broader definition of terroir. Right, but then, so we have the genetics, which were modified by terroir, which were modified by agricultural and post-harvest practices, which are then again modified by manufacturing processes. So how we choose to roast or not roast, how we choose to conch, how, are we using a ball mill in a conch, are we using a universal, are we doing little melangers? All of these things are going to affect the final chocolate. And then getting right to the end, we have this little symbol here, which is both a summation and an integration, which I thought was a great symbol to use here, is our sensory perception. And today we're going to be really focusing on sensory perception. Right? Really, really interesting. So no matter what goes on in terms of the left hand, the first set of terms to the right of the equal sign, right? In the end, it's all dependent upon that sensory perception, right? And the understanding that two people standing side by side who will have different sensory perception of the same things. So that's really, really important to understand. So before I jump into the next bit of this, just a quick shout out to Mark and Yuri at Blue Spruce Chocolate in Kittredge, Colorado. Thanks for joining us again. And then, the engineer in me loves that formula as well. It's really compact, shorthand. I forgot genetics, and I'll put it back in when I get done to do this. But it does provide a real interesting and straightforward framework for being able to discuss the topic, and before we get to the sensory perception part of it. So and listen, if anybody is really knows mathematics and symbols, and you can think of better symbols to use, let me know. And as long as they're in the character set that I've got here, I'll be able to use them. So please let me know about that. So I'm going to go work on that. I might be able to do. I wonder if I can do some CSS or HTML mathematical typesetting. So if anybody wants to translate this into something which looks more like an actual, tech or mathematical formula, let me know, and I will be happy to throw that in and let everybody know who helped me with that. Right. So the rest of today's conversation is really going to be rooted in a presentation I made last October for the annual symposium and the annual meeting of the British Society of Flavourists. And this meeting took place up in northern Italy around Lake Como district, right? So north and slightly west of Milan. And I did it virtually. So I was here in Arizona when I made the presentation. And the image which is at the top of this was in fact the first image of the presentation, and then this is once we get into the title page for the presentation, this is the first slide of the presentation. We're going to go through it, and I'm going to talk about what it is that I mean. And again, if you have ideas or comments or questions that you'd like to make about any of these slides, just throw them into the comments and I will get back to them during the course of the episode. And I lost my train of thought. It happens sometimes. I'm sorry to do that. So if we go back to when we think about taste, so what is flavor? What is taste? Are they the same thing or exactly are they not? So many people would think that taste, right, is a combination of what we sense on the tongue and what we sense on the nose. So flavor and aroma. So we need to say, okay, what is it that we mean when we're doing this? So the words we use are incredibly important, and this is something that has been a part of the Pod Safe Chocolate and the Chocolate Life Live and the work that I've been doing on the Chocolate Life for many years. So when we think about articulating, right, what we are sensing, well, we are in fact translating. So we have these chemical sensations which go on in our mouth and nose, and our brain interprets them in a particular kind of way. And then from that, what we need to do is we need to come up with words to describe to others what we're sensing. Right? So this is why vocabulary is important. But it turns out also that the way we visualize the vocabulary and just the visualizations that we use are also incredibly important. And right, many people know the phrase "there are lies, damn lies, and there are statistics." Yes, and there also infographics can be used to lie. And this is something that I'll learn. If anybody is at all interested in infographics and good infographics and bad infographics, there is a great book, and I'll put a link to it. It'll be an Amazon affiliate link on the page today, to the first book by Edward Tufte, Tufte, called The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. It is a fabulous introduction to infographics. And I can't recommend it more highly. I ran into the book probably for the first time while I was a student at Rhode Island School of Design, 1983, thereabouts, and fortunately had a chance to take a class from Mr. Tufte a couple of years later. It just really, really gets you thinking about how the images that you choose to use have an effect on your perception of things. And so these are two images which talk about the same thing. Now, the image on the left was used by the company Shoko, which is still around today, but it is a format that is used a lot, right? So it is a pyramid, right? The pyramid, which talks about 4 different segments of the cocoa marketplace. So the bottom segment of the market is the commodity or bulk market, and we move from there up to conventional/certified, right, and then we move up to that, and it says the third level is cacao fino, and then the fourth one is exclusive cacao fino, right? And this does a good job to say that there are 4 different levels of the marketplace, and that it conveys the idea that there is more cocoa at the bottom level and less cocoa in the top level. But what it doesn't do, right, even though the numbers are in that image, it doesn't give you any idea of like the relative size of the markets. And so you look for this and you go, okay, I see the numbers, but I look at the image and I'm having trouble making sense of the two of those things. So all I did was take the numbers from that pyramid and plot it in a pie graph. Right. And so that is the image on the right. And what you get is, okay, when it comes to that pyramid, right? This is what the actual percentage is that each one of these areas of the market represent. So the conventional bulk market, the commodity bulk market, ends up being 72% of the market. The conventional plus certified ends up being another 16% of the market, right? And so on. And so this is the one on the right is a much more accurate representation of the data that is trying to be communicated on the left. And this is why visualization, the visualizations that we choose to use, right, turn out to be hugely important, right? And so it's also really important to understand that we have at least three audiences for the vocabulary and the visualizations that we're putting together. So we have a professional audience. So these are people who are trained, who are used to specialist vocabulary, who are used to communicating with each other around these topics. There's some specialized knowledge that gives them a better ability to be able to understand what others are saying. So we do have a professional audience, right? Then we have what's called a prosumer audience, so a cross between a professional and consumer. And these are many of the people who call themselves chocolate critics or who've gone through tasting classes, either through the International Institute of Cocoa Chocolate Tasting or they've taken a class from Hazel Lee using her Tasting in Color. These are people who have educated themselves, right, to a higher level of understanding, but are not necessarily earning a living, either part-time or full-time, using the knowledge that they found. So they have a better understanding of the term, but not to the depth that somebody who is a professional has. And then you have a consumer audience, right? And it turns out that it may be that a visualization and a set of vocabulary, which is good for one group, is not necessarily good for another group. And before we go on to the next slide, where I start talking about what some of these visualizations are, what I want to say is when you learn to taste, whether it's chocolate or coffee or anything else, what you are learning when you go through, like a wine, a WSET style of education, is you are training your tasting memory. That's it. You don't necessarily need to be a quote unquote super taster, right? What you need to do is to pay attention, because what you need to do is you need to taste something and go, I recognize what this flavor is. So you put something in your mouth and you're trying to describe what you're tasting. And you say, ooh, this is blueberry, right? And you put that blueberry into your taste memory. So this is what blueberry tastes like, chocolate. And then you might say, I'm able to say, well, this is what dry blueberry tastes like, and this is what fresh blueberry tastes like, right? That's an interesting thing to do. And I'm putting that into my data bank. So, and this is just repetition. Repetition, 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 right? If you've never tasted a Bordeaux, you're never going to be able to recognize a Bordeaux. If you've never tasted a Côte du Rhône, you're never going to be able to recognize a Côte du Rhône. If you've never tasted Jabuti Kaba, you are never going to be able to recognize Jabuti Kaba. And so learning how to taste, quote unquote, learning how to taste, taking these classes is about training your taste memory. And the people who are really good about it aren't necessarily the ones who can immediately go, oh, this is what Jabuti Kaba is, right? But once they understand what that is, they can put it in their taste memory. And then what they can do is when they run across it again, they can recognize that they've already tasted it and then be able to fish into their memory after they go, oh, I know what this is. And then they can fish into memory and go, this is what this is. So this reminds me of blueberry, or it reminds me of dried blueberry, or it reminds me of cherry, or dried cherry, or Rainier cherry, or all very, very precise definitions. But this is what it is. It's all about training your taste memory, right? To be able to put something in your data bank, to be able to recognize it when you taste it again, and then to be able to articulate what it is you're tasting to yourself and to other people, right? And the best tool that you can have to be able to help you with this is a notebook, right? When you're tasting something, you're paying close attention, and then write down whatever your sensory perceptions are. They're neither right nor they're wrong. They're for you. I like to do this in a group because I may not recognize something and somebody else in the group may recognize something. And then I'll be able to, oh, yes, that's what you're tasting. Or, oh, that's not what I taste, but I can understand why you think you're tasting, or not why you think, but why you are tasting what you are tasting. Really, 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 I find it much more useful to do in group settings, and not just a silent setting, but a group setting where everybody has a chance to talk to themselves, talk to each other about what they're doing. Really, really useful, really, really valuable. And so what I recommend. And so here are two different visualizations of the Specialty Coffee Association flavor wheel for coffee. Now, the one on the left, I would say, is one that is more consumer friendly, in the sense that it is, there's not a whole lot of visual information that is unnecessary. So, for example, the one on the right, which I believe is part of Counterculture's coffee, their flavor wheel, the fact that these colors have texture in them are distracting, right? And they make the thing harder to read. It would be more useful, I think, if they were just flat colors like the one on the left. These are basically the same information. There are some slight differences between the two, but they're basically the same information. And they work from the more general in the center to the more specific, right, in the hour. So when you're teaching about, how do you go and think about flavors, you might want to start off with, oh, this is earthy, and then go, oh, this reminds me of mushrooms, and then, oh, this reminds me of a specific type of mushroom. So you'd go from the more general to the more specific, and both of these visualizations are organized that way. The more general descriptions are in the center, fruity, right? And then I get to, ooh, is it a tropical fruit or is it a red fruit? And those are in the next layer, and then there are specific descriptions about specific tropical flavors, or fresh fruit flavors, or brown fruit flavors. I mean, they work the same way, right? But what's interesting to me, right, and this, from somebody who spent 4 years at Rhode Island School of Design and has spent time before I got into chocolate, thinking about information design and designing software, right, for helping professionals communicate. Paint systems, 3D modeling systems, business graphic systems. These are things that I've done in my professional life before I got to chocolate. What's interesting about this on the right is that this is a two-dimensional plot here, right? And I don't know if you can see the cursor, but this is also these are both two-dimensional plots. But in the counterculture, right, episode, what they do is they have a couple of other axes. So we have an axis which is related to body. So this is what this column is. This is a body. And we have low, medium, and high classifications. And within each one of these classifications, which are more general, we have more specific nomenclature within each one. So this particular table over here adds a third dimension, right? And so this plot here on the right is no longer two-dimensional. It is going to be three-dimensional. And what I might do is I might apply a body descriptor to any one of the flavors that are in here. So the body of this could modify my perception. So this is at least a three-dimensional graph. And then I have this other table over here on the right, which is adjectives which relate to intensity, right? And so all of a sudden, this is a four-dimensional graph, right? And so a professional wants to know this stuff, not necessarily a consumer, and a prosumer, somewhere in the middle here. But what's really important to think about this is a combination of three two-dimensional graphs the best way to represent flavor, right? So are there things that we can do, right, which would be able to help us articulate what we're doing if we change the number of dimensions in the graph? So if we put this into a database and we can write some visualization tools in Python. We might be able to use things that are in Wolfram Alpha and other things like that. We can actually generate some very, very interesting more than two-dimensional graphs, which are going to help us understand flavor, right, more intuitively than trying to do our own construction and then deconstruction of these multidimensional graphs, right? And this is where I think there is a lot of work to be done, especially in the world of professional flavor science, is to be able to figure out, are there better visualizations that can be done? And by the way, this is just in English, right? And so one of the challenges that we face is, okay, I can convert this into Spanish and I can convert this into French. I'm going to, if in Spanish, I need to think about, what is the difference between Castilian Spanish, so the Spanish spoken in Spain, and the Spanish spoken in Latin America. Jugo is the word for juice in Latin America, and zumo is the word for juice in Spain, right? And so we can't assume that the descriptors that are used in one language, one dialect of a language, are going to be the same as the descriptors used in another dialect of the same language. We have the same issue in Portuguese. So that which is spoken as Lisbon is going to be different from that which is spoken in Portugal. And not only that, but in São Paulo, but in Brazil, how well do they know a flavor? Now, I've been to Brazil and I've had jabuticaba, right? But if you were in Lisbon or Porto and you've never had jabuticaba before, and I said to you, this reminds me of jabuticaba, you have not just the language problem, but you have this synonym problem. So maybe the best way to think about jabuticaba is something like a blueberry. And so, what is the word for blueberry? It might be arándano in Spanish. It could be mirtil in French. I mean, it's a really, really interesting question because we've just added layers of complexity to this just by considering the language components of what this is going on. And oh, by the way, what we might want to do, you're right, we want to have a canonical representation, and maybe English is the best language, maybe, for the canonical representation. But then there's a Latin term for this, and so we may want to add we may want to go back that far and be able to understand the etymology of these words. And then, do we know anything about the chemistry of this? And so are there chemicals which are associated with these things? And so all of a sudden, we go from this very, very simple two-dimensional representation. And the question becomes, what other dimensions of data are there that we can add to this, which will make it just a lot more useful, right, to professionals at one end, but how do we get to something which communicates more effectively to consumers? And so I want to say that probably the worst graph ever that could possibly have been chosen to communicate flavor is the spider graph. So these are examples of the spider graph. And so we have one on the left for coffee and one on the right for cocoa. And one of the challenges that are associated with spider graphs is we need to make sure that the axes that are used in each one of the graphs are the same, right? So, thinking about a coffee graph as opposed to a cocoa graph, just let's focus on the coffee graph. So we have the fragrance of sulfur, the fragrance of sweet, the aroma of dark cherry, the aroma of sulfur. We got a bunch of different axes here. But if I use a different set of axes, so another person, another company, someone else, any entity uses a different set of axes, these graphs are no longer directly comparable, right? So even if there is some logic and some training. So these are all put together by Q graders. They all know what they're doing, right? If the axes are different or the value of the axes is different, you need to normalize all of the axes to make sure that the shape of the graphs were the same. And in order for the shapes for the graph to be the same, need to be using the same axes and the same axes in the same order, right? And so bang. Right? This is really hard. We have that same thing when it comes to chocolate. So we have cocoa, aroma, bitterness, acidity, whether it's burnt, probably roast components of it, fruity. Yeah, but fruity, is it sort of a tropical fruity? Is it a brown fruity? That's different. Nuts is good. Earthy, astringency. And, astringency is in a weird place because astringency isn't a flavor. It's a sensation. Right? So it's a trigeminal nerve sensation in the mouth, astringency is, right? And so does it belong here on a chart? And the answer may be no. But the real thing is, what we're doing is I'm guessing burnt is related to this low roast, medium roast, and high roast. And now what we've done is we've done 3 different flavor analyses So we've taken a chocolate made with low roast beans, medium roast beans, and heavily roasted beans, and we've overlaid them on top of each other. And good luck, right, in very, very quickly understanding what the differences are based upon the differences in roast. Right, really, really challenging. They're there, so we can see that this low roast is much higher in acidity, and the medium roast is lower in acidity, and the blue line is, I mean, it's a challenge. I mean, you have to work really hard. And if you were to put them side by side, you still had, here's the next example. If you put them side by side, and this is cocoa beans, not chocolate, but if you put them side by side, what do these shapes actually tell you? Right? So what do you know about this shape compared with the shape in red, right? And how does it tell you, right? How you're going on. So you need the flavor descriptors down here and all this other information to be able to help you understand what these graphs are. And so having these things side by side, really, really challenging in order to be able to figure out what it is that's going on. I understand, for those of people who know my history, between 2000 and 2014 and 2017, I worked with Ingeman down in Nicaragua, specifically Zoe Papalexandrato, who's been the chief science or been the science lead for MOCCA, the Maximizing Opportunities in Coffee and Cocoa and Coffee and Cocoa in the Americas, and the work that they've been doing in terms of characterizing different cocos from different parts of the Americas. And then figuring out how to display the similarities and the differences. And this is where, how are these things similar and what are the differences? I mean, for me, and I've been looking at these things for a long time, this is really, really challenging stuff for me to be able to figure out, and I'm used to doing it. And before I want to go on to the next slide here, what I want to do is do a quick shout out to Daniel Corson. Hey, Daniel, insightful and thought-provoking. I'm glad you think so. It's really interesting to me. But what I can, if you're still watching, is there a single most provoking thought? Right. So when you look at what it is that I've been talking about, especially as we go and look at, I think, this is when you responded, on this slide. What about it, right? What about what my description was, said, ooh, I mean, I need to start thinking about this maybe in a slightly different way. So I'm really interested to know if you're still watching what that is. All right. So this is the Cacao of Excellence, formerly Cocoa of Excellence flavor wheel, right? And it is a standard flavor wheel in many aspects. What there isn't is, what they've done is they've actually inverted to some extent. So the more general observations are on the outside. So we have floral here and woody here and spice and nutty. We have them out here. We have this whole fruit level and we have acidity. Note that bitterness and astringency don't necessarily have descriptors, which are associated with subdescriptors. So we've got fresh fruit, berry, citrus, tropical. Right here we have bitterness, but we don't have any subdescriptors. Right, so they've taken it and they've inverted it. I don't necessarily know that this is better, but it is different. And one of the things that I really like about the presentation of this is a side-by-side page, it's in a manual, is that there are in fact descriptors here. So when we say that something is woody, right, this is what we mean. And there are a bit of sub-descriptors in there. So when somebody says woody, under this system, here's the rubric which says, here's how you're going to talk about woody. Really, really important, really, really helpful, really to understand. And then there's a rating scale on the other side of this. Again, this is a 2D representation, and even when this 2D representation is presented on a screen, right, it is still a 2D representation, right? And one of the questions that I ask myself, and this is a question that I ask the Cacao of Excellence people, is can we do something like this, which is, if we're on a computer, which is more interactive, right? So can we, rather than having to go to a table like this, can we over, can we mouse over this and click, and then the descriptions, right, show up underneath it. So, there is a sort of um, failure of imagination, I think, right? To say, how can we use the computer tools that we have in order to make this kind of work much easier to use and understand, and how do we articulate what it is that's going on? There might be, I don't necessarily need all the information which is shown in this table if I just want to understand, when I say dark fresh fruit, which fruits am I referring to, right? I don't need all the rest of this stuff. Maybe I just want to focus in on it. And so I think that there's a way to take this particular map, and if you were to, you could turn it into an interactive map and make it much, much more useful and much more intuitive for a lot more people, especially for the average consumer, this is a visualization that I think would really work well for an average consumer. And then we might have layers of this that we could turn on and off, which would give the prosumer and the professional a lot more detail behind what's going on. So I think that's really, 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 really important to know. But here's, very, very simply, an inversion of the more general to more specific presentation, excuse me, which we saw in the SCA wheel. Sort of breaking through the multi-layer things in dimensions of this, which are not, which don't require multiple layers. So really, really, I think there's some really interesting lessons to learn here. I just wish they had gone further. Anyway, so for Daniel, so in response, the framework of how to break down flavors from basic, like fruity and earthy, and how to train yourself to get more and more nuanced with specific flavor profiles. Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's really, 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 really important to know, because I think that if you're in a group situation where people are breaking down flavors, one of the challenges you have is that there will be people in the room who are more experienced and more skilled than you are, and there will be people in the room who are less experienced and less skilled than you are. So you're probably not the most skilled. You may be the most skilled in the person in the room. You may be the least skilled person or an experienced person in the room. But I think that, if I go back to a personal experience, I was once in a tasting exercise where one of the people put a chocolate in her mouth and went, their mouth, right? I don't want to, well, one of the people in the room put a chocolate in their mouth and they immediately went to matsutake mushrooms. That was the first thing out of their mouth. And I don't necessarily know that I could tell you what the difference was between a matsutake mushroom and a shiitake mushroom was fresh, right? And I certainly don't know that I could tell you what the difference was between a matsutake mushroom and a shiitake mushroom was in chocolate, right? And then all the variabilities of the chocolate. So what kind of cocoa, how much sugar there is, what the roast level is, all those things are going to affect the perception of that flavor. But if I was a inexperienced person in that room, I might give up. I'd say, I'm never going to be able to get to that point, right? Because I'm tasting this, and I maybe I get earthy, but I don't get mushroomy, and maybe I get umami, but I don't get mushroomy, right? So it's really, really important to train yourself to work from the more general to the more specific, and not to skip those steps. It is fruity, right? Okay, so it's fruity. Do I think it's red fruit, or do I think it's a tropical fruit, or do I think it's a citrus fruit? Right? Really, so do that categorization on the levels. Don't try to go Mandarin orange. Okay, so it's an orange. What's the difference between a Mandarin orange and a Seville orange? Right. So these are very, 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 very serious questions. But train yourself, right, to go through the discipline of going up the ladder or down the ladder or in or out, however you want to think about your visualization, whatever works for you. And the other thing this does is, if you're working in group situations, you can guide people through that process. Okay, what are you tasting? Are you tasting fruit? Are you tasting earthy? Is it nutty? Do you think it's spicy? Ooh, it's spicy. Well, do you think it's like a warm spicy, like a Christmas? Do you think it's spicy or spicy like a hot pepper? What kind of spicy are you referring to? Right, and you can guide people through. Really, really important, really, really strong method of teaching, right, and communicating about flavor. it's like, yeah, you could get people to say, this reminds me of, um, leather, right? And, okay, so yeah, we know what leather, or we know what tobacco is, but there's a wide range of flavors and aromas that are in tobacco. And so I hope you understand, I could go on about this for a long period of time, but I think it's really important, right, to allow yourself the luxury, right, of not having to be incredibly specific or get to that, or think that you need to be able to get to that level of specificity, right? And this is something I first recognized Cho did a very, very long time ago when they introduced their bars. They said, listen, we've got basically only four. We have the chocolatey bar, they use cocoa from Ghana, right? We have the nutty bar, right? We have the fruity bar. And that's how they presented their bars when they started off. So you could say, I'm interested in something which is chocolatey, and that's what I would choose. And irrespective of what the origin was, right? So what the producing country was for the beans, that was the primary flavor appellation and description on the front of the bars. And you could go to the back and say, there might be a more specific description of what those fruit flavors were, the chocolate flavors were, the nutty flavors were. But on the front, you can go, and they were all color coded as well. So I can say, oh, I want the yellow label bar, or I want the brown label bar, or I want the green label bar. Just really, really smart. And, they did a lot of smart things very early on. They did a lot of really stupid things as well. But that was one of the things I think that they did really, 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 really well. So just anyway, so I want to show you another example of where we can add a whole lot of extra visual information and not improve communication. So this is a flavor wheel similar to this flavor wheel. I think you can do a pretty close transposition of one to the other. But what's this green thing out here, and why is it wavy, and why are there textures and all this other kind of stuff? It makes no sense whatsoever. It makes it much more difficult to read. So and there are two versions of this. There's a professional version, which is much more detailed. This is the professional version of it, and then there's a consumer version. But this was in a book called Hidden Persuaders in Cocoa and Chocolate. And what they were doing is they were trying to map, among other things, particular flavors with particular emotional states, right? And then they also connected a particular flavor to a particular chemical compound. It's a really interesting book. It may be available on Amazon. If it is, I'll put a link to it. It's worth having a copy and reading through it and helping you understand a little bit more about how these things work. So really, and again, for people who know my background, Calabout has invited me to the global launch events for things like Ruby chocolate and second generation chocolate. I was at ISM, which is a big show in Cologne, Germany in 2018 at the Cologne Messe. I was there in 2018 for the global launch of this book. And I got a chance to speak with the chief researcher at Barry Calabout, and one of the people, I think, at the Flavor House Givaudan, who was also involved in working with this. So yeah, it's, here they have, rather than just astringency, they have, there's this wedge in the graph down here called trigeminal, right? So these are nerve sensations, and they go. So these are they're taking the same idea and they're representing it in slightly different ways for different audiences, right? But all this extra stuff, what's this extra green for? It makes no sense. Why are we have these holes in it? Why is this? Maybe it's designed to look like a cocoa pod. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are more than 10 ridges, so it can't be a cocoa pod. Why is there texture in the color? It may be more visually interesting in one respect, but it makes it much more difficult to read. Right. And so having gone through all of that, right, what I want to go through is talk a little bit about some of the work that I did. So in 2015, I was at Chocoa, and I was having a conversation with Brigitte La Liberté and Ed Seguin, who were, part of the Cacao of Excellence program. And Ed and I were talking about just how much we hated spider graphs. Just, every time that they were presenting their flavor profiles for the finalists and the winners of the competition, what they were doing is they were presenting spider graphs. and we were lamenting about how bad they were. And so Ed came to me and said, hey, Clay, do you want to do some work? Well, he didn't come to me. We're sitting there talking, and I said, listen, I was it maybe it was in Paris at the Salon du Chocolat. I don't remember. But it was in 2014, 2015, and it makes more sense. It was Paris. Obviously, I didn't script this part. Maybe Paris in 2014. In any event, Ed and I were talking about this, and I said, "Listen, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go and think about: is there a better way to represent flavor, right, in cocoa and chocolate, um, um, than a spider graph?" And this is what I came up with. And so, if you look at the 2015, 17, and 19 editions of the Cocoa of Excellence, if you look at some of the Cocoa of Excellence materials, certainly the first editions of the MOCCA Flavor Map, Central American Flavor Map, use this representation. This is sometimes called a radial pie chart. Sometimes it's a version of a type of polar graph. And literally, right, what we've done here is rather than connect the axes. So, we can see that here is the axis point for this value. And what we've done is we've gone out here and said, here is the value of this component. We put a point there. And what we're doing is we're connecting the lines from point to point. This is how the spider graph works, right? What we've done is what I did is I said, what happens if we just rotate this a few degrees, right? And instead of connecting the lines between these different axes, what we're going to do is we're actually going to fill in the sectors, right? Really, really simple idea. And then what we're going to do is we're going to divide this up. So we have an axis here. I don't understand why it's um, moving so much. But we have an axis here. So we have within a sector, a larger sector, we have cocoa astringency and bitterness, which are related to each other. And cocoa is independent, I think, but we just wanted to have these dark axis lines to say these things are different from the other things, right? And so we're using the line weights and the fact that we're using dotted lines and dashed lines to signify some things to make it easier to read the chart overall. So we have one, which is cocoa and astringency and bitterness. We have another sector, which is sweetness, acidity, fresh fruit, and brown fruit. And then we have a fourth one, which is our third one, floral, spicy, nutty, and woody. So we put together all the fruit and fruit acid components into one section. Now, what's interesting about this particular representation, which is in the labels, is the one on the left is the flavor evaluation for a particular sample, COEX sample number 28, 2015, right? That's what that COEX 2815L means at the top, right? And what you have is this is the flavor of the liquor based upon the evaluation, the summation of the evaluation of all of the members of the tasting panel. And so we get from the liquor component, I'm going to have to get rid of that. So in the liquor component, what we find is that there is a lot of astringency. That's what this angle means. There's a lot of astringency, and what happens is there's a lot of fresh fruit and fresh fruit acidity with a tiny bit of floral component in it. And these are what's dominate. There's a little bit of cocoa, there's some bitterness, a lot of astringency, and a lot of fruit with a little bit of floral in the liquor, right? And then just by the reason why the colors are what the colors are is that we realized that we wouldn't always be able to communicate in color, and people might be making black and white photocopies of this or converting into black and white, and we wanted colors that were next to each other, which were visually distinctive, right? So that even if you didn't have a color reference to it, you could, in fact, if it were black and white, you could be able to see that the sections of each wedge were different, right? The color of each sector, the density of each sector were different from the ones next to it. So with this, there's almost no spice. There's very little nuttiness, and just a little bit more woodiness. There's some brown fruit, but not very much. And then you go to this one, and what you find is, whoa, using the Cocoa of Excellence standardized recipe, you take this liquor And then when you get done, all of a sudden, you've got something which is a lot of cocoa. So it's very, very cocoa forward, right? That bitterness hasn't changed at all, but the astringency has come way down, right? And that what used to be a dominant, fresh fruit acidity, right, has turned into a more dominant brown fruit, so less fresh and less acidity in it. So it's really, really easy to go back and forth between these two and to be able to understand how they are different. And side by side, it's really easy to make this understanding. It's a lot harder if we were to do the same thing on a spider graph, right? Just from experience, I can let you know, right? Now, these are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. And if you go take a look at the 2021, and I think that what we're doing with what COAX is doing, the Cocoa Cacao of Excellence is doing with the announcement next week, they're using a different version of these graphs, right? And I can just share with you one of the reasons why they were using the spider graphs as opposed to another form of graph is that number one is that the spider graph is something you can do in Microsoft Excel. So you can just take a table and go bank, and it will generate for you a spider graph. And so it was very, very easy. If they were doing different kinds of graphs, they would have had to manually build them. And so I worked with a programmer, and the programmer wrote a tool, and we would just feed it an Excel worksheet, a CSV, from a worksheet, and it would generate all these graphs automatically. And so it used to take, even in Excel, days and days and days to do. We could end up doing in minutes, right? And then programmatically, we could change aspects of what were going on. So we over the course of the 3 or 4 years, we were, notice, for example, that, inside here, there is the white dotted line, right, which shows up the top. And so the layers are interleaved with each other, so you get a better sense of. And there are lots of details that you can play with in terms of the visual representation. Now, these are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. One might say is that this is not a linear representation. The volume of this becomes greater, or the area of this becomes greater as it becomes bigger, and so it's not a straight linear. So this probably should be a logarithmic scale rather than a linear scale, so there to be a better representation of it. But the great thing about this is because we're generating these graphics programmatically, right? What we can do is we can use a different tool, and we can generate a different graphic for it. And one of the things that I can do manually, and I did it in my presentation because it's easy to do in PowerPoint, a little more difficult to do here. But one of the things you can do is you can put the cocoa graph, right, on top of the liquor graph on top of the chocolate graph. And then what you can do is you can animate between the two of them. So you can visually see through animation what the flavor change is, right? And that turns out to be really, really cool, right? To be able to do is to be able to say, I see it here, and I can see the way the flavor evolves between the liquor and the chocolate. And if I had a bean evaluation, I would love to have that, I would love to be able to scrub through, again, not side by side, but on top of each other and animate. Here is the flavor descriptor associated with the raw beans. Here is the flavor descriptor associated with the liquor. Here are the flavor descriptors associated with the chocolate. And then what I would love to be able to do is get, from the judging panels here, is go, this brown fruit, we have a bunch of descriptors. So even though the average turns out to be 5.67, what is the median? Where, was it as high as 6 and as low as 4? Were people thinking this brown fruit as opposed to some other brown fruit? There is a lot of other stuff that you can do here when you think about, let's put it on a computer. How can we animate it? What are the other dimensions of information that we can put into this to make it much more useful, to help communicate flavor? And so, I do have to thank Ilya Starin for the programming work that he did on this, because it was really, really fascinating for me to help understand some of the variables and some of the things that we needed to look at and get an idea about some of the things that we can do. Now, unfortunately, nobody is interested, or nobody has evidenced any interest in doing any of the more advanced aspects of this work, which for me is a disappointment. I would really love to be able to find the resources to be able to. I mean, I'm working on a vocabulary. Or, we talked about, is it Castilian Spanish or Latin Spanish? Is it continental Portuguese, or is it Brazilian Portuguese? And then to go back from a canonical English name to a Latin name to the chemical names that are associated with this. I mean, and if you can put that into a table, and then you can use it as a resource for these, I was like, yeah, I really want to do that kind of stuff. It's really, really exciting to me. It's like, this would be really, really fun to do. And I think the last slide, I showed you earlier. So this is again from Barry Calabout ISM 2018. Is that there is a much more complicated, so this is the flavor wheel for professionals that Calabout put together in their book Hidden Persuaders, but then they released a version for consumers. Now, this is much less complicated, as you can see, so that makes a lot of sense, but they still have all this extra detail. What is all this green stuff out here, and why? It's like, it's just visual cruft that gets in the way of understanding what's going on. But, really, really important, mouthfeel, aroma, taste, right? Okay, so they've divided up into 3 quadrants that are really, really easy to understand, and boom, right? So that mouthfeel doesn't have the same number of dimensions as some of the other things do. I mean, it's instantly visible in here. Really, really, really important, really, really cool. What I didn't like is that the people who worked on this book contacted me about just after the first set of flavors wheels I did for Cocoa of Excellence. So in 2015, this book came out in 2018, right? I was contacted by Barry Calabout and said, hey, we'd like to work with you about, doing your radial pie charts. And I said, hey, here is a consulting contract, and you can hire me, and I will work with my programmer, and we can develop you a set of tools to do these kinds of things. But otherwise, I'm not helping you. But the actual design is in the public domain. There's nothing I could do. It was out there published. There's really no way to patent it, right? Copyright is only about the specific implementation of an idea. But here's an example of where it fails, right? If you're not really thinking about this hard enough, is that here we have one of these flavor wheels. So these radial pie charts, which is talking about dark chocolate characteristics. Right? And here we have is a similar chart, but this one down here is for ruby, right? And it turns out there's no way to compare the two, which is unfortunate, right? So it would have been much more interesting to say, how is ruby the same as and different from a dark chocolate by overlaying them and being able to scrub between them? So here is a fruity dark chocolate, and here is ruby, and here's how they're different. You cannot do this, right? And so while I am really annoyed that, Calabout, multi-billion-dollar company, took my idea and to some extent, I think, ruined it. They didn't come to me and say, yeah, we're spending, millions of dollars on this project. We'd like your involvement to make sure we're doing it right. Because there are ways to use these ideas as training tools. And those training tools are different from what most people think of as training tools. So it's really, really important to do this. And how are these going to be used as training tools? So just a quick note before I got a couple of images before I'm having trouble in locating my cursor today. So just a quick shout out to Mike King at Encore Coffee. Hey, Mike, good to see you today. And then Daniel, there are no silly questions. The only silly questions are the ones that get unasked. Do you have any tips for tasting chocolate in terms of how much and where to put it on your tongue and mouth? So the answer is, yeah, I do. But I think that the most important thing is that whatever method you choose, you do it consistently, right? So that you have the same process each time, and then you have the same thought process in terms of analysis each time. So yeah, break it, good thing. If you're going to open up the pack and smell, do that. Then break it and smell, because sometimes breaking it will, because it's a fresh surface, there might be something new. I tend to rub my thumb against the back of the chocolate because it'll warm it up and it will release different aromas. right? And so what I'm looking for when I do that is the differences. Is the difference in smell from opening the packet to breaking it to warming it up and smelling it? How are they different? Right. So, is there some new experience which is associated with it? And again, when I'm opening up for the first time, general experiences. Is it sweet? Am I smelling fruit? Does it smell roasty? Does it smell chocolate? I'm looking for just general experiences, general stuff going on first. So yeah, start out that way. And you can get more specific, right, as you go, oh, is there a different aroma on the break? Yeah, it's sweeter, or it's not as sweet, or I'm tasting more sugar. Again, that's sweet. Or am I smelling more fruit or less fruit? Is it more roasty or less roasty? When I'm warming it up, do that, right? So what I will do is put a piece of chocolate in the mouth and chew hard, right, 3 or 4 times, right? And what I'm looking for is what I call the bite, right? Right. And you want to know how firm the bite is. And sometimes the bite is firm because the chocolate is crunchy or it's a lower cocoa butter content. And sometimes it's crunchy because the piece is thicker, right? And so you want to understand that. And then if the sugar is not fully refined, it might be gritty from the sugar. You'll get that on the bite. The chew is going to help you, if the chew is going to help you refine. Hold on just a second, everybody. All right. So someone else in the house just knock on the door to let me know. Anyway, so I want to know the difference between the bite and the chew. So I don't just bite one or two, three, bite down, right? I'm going to chew a couple of times to start the melting process. And what I'm thinking about is, is that chew easy or hard, right? And again, it could be, is it crunchy because of the fact that it's over crystallized? Is it crunchy because it's a lower cocoa butter content? Is it crunchy because there's an inclusion or some sugar crystal? Is it over crystallized? These are the sorts of things I'm looking at there. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of that, I'm going to put it on the top of my tongue, and I'm going to worry it against the base of my teeth, right? And I'm going to say, am I getting some other texture, right, in there? So is there a grit which might not be the sugar? And then I'm going to move all of it and put it on my tongue, back on my tongue, and I'm just going to let it melt, right? I might open my mouth and guppy, right? Right. And because I'm interested in, what's happening as the chocolate melts and what am I getting retronasally? Because a lot of my impression of the flavor is going to be from what it is that I'm smelling, right? Not just what it is the way my tongue is experiencing. And then I'm also taking a look at, astringency. I'm not taking a look at, I'm thinking about astringency. Is it astringent? Where in my mouth is it astringent? Is it astringent above the tongue, on the sides of the mouth, below the tongue, in the front of the mouth, in the back of the mouth? Is the astringency come and go? Does it start off with no astringency and end astringent? So I'm thinking about changes over time as well. How does the flavor change over time? Does it start off chocolatey and go to fruity and then go to chocolate and all of a sudden there's some vanilla or some nuts? I mean, these are the sorts of things, right, that I'm thinking of. But that's the process that I'm going through. But it's comparative in nature. So I'm thinking, oh, this is now different from what? How is it different over time, right? And so I'm like thinking less descriptively, right, and thinking more comparatively, and that's what works for me, right? So that's how I do it. And then if I'm doing a serious professional evaluation, what I will do is I will let the chocolate, after it has left my mouth, sit in my mouth and throat for 2 to 3 to 4 minutes. Thinking is like, what are the long aftertastes? Because I've discovered that if there is some defect either in the beans or in manufacturing, or because you're using a non-conventional sweetener, for example, or a milk that may be less than optimum, that you'll get those impressions on the very, very long aftertaste. So I don't necessarily wash my mouth out or clear my palate, again, when I'm doing a professional evaluation for quite some time. So Daniel, hope that answers the question. Hey Frank, howdy back. Listen, we need to coordinate on putting together a tasting of your products. So, let's get together on Facebook um, fairly soon. And then we'll have a chance to schedule an episode of Pod Safe Chocolate to talk about what you're doing. All right, very, very cool. Now Joe, I want to say that, these are the more conventional, right, approaches to doing it. So we have this kind of flavor wheel, and people are now very familiar with this radial pie chart, which I think I'm the first person to ever use in chocolate. Just I think I've never seen anybody use it before, but more and more people are adopting it over the spider graph, which makes me feel real, real good. If you think it's more understandable, let me know. I'm really interested in knowing your thought about how the radial pie chart is more communicative than a spider graph. So I'd be really cool about that. And then, but there are lots of other ways to do it. So here is a chart that's put together. Hazel Lee, it's the Taste with Color Flavor Map. And this combines two different things, right, which I think are really, really valuable. All right. And depending on where you are in your journey, right? So if you're really experienced, this may be helpful. If you're not very experienced, this may be helpful. I think it's more for prosumers and consumers than it is professionals. I don't know if people use this on a regular basis. But what this does is it provides a visual association through color with a flavor vocabulary. And so you can make that flavor, and so you can make these associations. And it's helpful in terms of, this is in two-dimensional space. It's not in a circle, which is a completely arbitrary decision, which is just about presenting the data in a compact form. This provides, so I'm a spatial, I remember things a lot spatially, for example. So, if I look around, where things are, I'm going to close my mind and say the last time I saw it was over here, or the last time I saw something was over here, or remember where it is. So in this particular case, this is what's going on here, is that you can think about flavors and associate them geographically and with a color. And so this is going to help you put things away in your data bank, right? And provide additional clues, which are going to help you pull that sensory data out of your memory and then help you articulate it, right? And if you find this helpful and valuable, go make it work for you, because any tool that you can use to help you in the process of remembering, retrieving, and articulating, any tool that you can use is a good tool. And this is an example of a good tool. Now, this is a chocolate and cacao flavor profile map, which was put together by the International Institute for Chocolate and Cacao Tasting. And number one, I've got, I think they break some rules associated with, the conventional use of how we think about color. Not all fruits are pink. Not all herbs are yellow to brown. Vegetal is green, but is coconut vegetal? I mean, so there are a lot of associations in here which I don't get, right, personally, right? And what happens is that, but this is a quick rubric. What you do is you're going through, it's done online. This is, for the most part, is you actually go and you pick a bunch of different flavors, which are, which come to your mind first, right? And there is actually a neural connection underneath to how you physiochemically experience taste, right? And which is there. So again, for me, I find this confusing, right? I don't find it helpful. Now, it may be that I don't find it helpful or useful because I've never taken one of the classes, um, and um, the organizers of the IICCT have never said, "Hey, Clay, thank you for being a judge at all of our awards for many, many years. We'd like to invite you to a class so that you understand what it is you're doing better." That hasn't happened for one reason or another. But again, right, if you take an IICCT class and you think this is useful and helpful to you as a rubric, right, the challenge is, can you do it if you don't have access to an online tool? If you've just got the flat 2D map, is this better than this? I don't know that it is, right? But it doesn't really matter which one is necessarily. We can say objectively, I don't think we can say one is better than the another. They accomplish different purposes. The important part is whichever one of these things work for you as a tool that helps you navigate this is what I'm tasting. Or, again, I can start off, the flavor is herbal and spicy, and then it gets to something which is more certificate, more specific. Capsicum. right? But notice that there's no capsicum in the next layer. I go from capsicum out here, and then jasmine and geranium, and that's how is that lately? It is for me. For me, I think about the organization of this, and I'm not. I don't understand it. However, because of my conversations with Alex Rast and Martin Christie and Maricel, who are, and to a lesser extent, Monica. I don't know that I've talked with Monica Moschini about this particularly. I know that there is some very, very strong neuroscience that's underlying this. I just don't understand it. So, like this, it doesn't work for me. I don't understand the layers and how the layers work. And so I tend to work with other representations. But again, man, if this works for you, all in for it. Go for it. If you've taken level 1 or level 2 or level 3 tastings and you understand how this works, and it is helpful for you, go do it. If you've taken a class with Hazel or anybody who uses this, right, go for it. Make it work for you. If you find that these kinds of visualizations help you better, this visualization is based upon a wheel like this. And by the way, this wheel that we're seeing right here informs this visualization. There is a relationship between the two. Now with the 2021 cycle, and I certainly this cycle, I think there has been they're no longer one-to-one relationships, because in the current version they've changed the axes of these. I think that they've added one, and but in any event, they're different now. But there is, when you have, this kind of representation, that there is a one-to-one representation with this kind of representation, right? So you can go back and forth between the two and understand how they work together. For me, the way my brain works, this is what's really important for me. This is what works for me. But if that works for you, or if that works for you, all good. That's what you want to be able to go ahead and do. Right. And that is the presentation about communicating the flavors of chocolate and coffee. Notice that there was only one spider wheel in coffee. When I did this for the British Society of Flavourists, their symposium was about coffee, and there were a couple more slides which were coffee specific. And I didn't include them here, but I just wanted to say that the challenges are very, very similar, right? When you try to communicate the flavor of coffee and the flavor of chocolate. And it turns out there's a huge overlap with wine and spirits and beer. A lot of the vocabulary is the same when it comes to flavor. A lot of the vocabulary is the same. A lot of the vocabulary is the same when it comes to texture, but there are some very differences, very, very strong differences. With spirits, beer and alcohol, you have to think about a dimension of space which talks about alcoholicness of it, right? So, and how does the how does the perception of alcohol affect the so really, really complex, really, really interesting for me, really, really understanding, really, really fascinating, and something that I want to work on a lot more. And listen, I hope you find it fascinating, and that you find it interesting, and it's something that you think is worthy of working on in the future. And that's today's episode of Pod Save Chocolate, with just a couple of things really quickly from Frank. Looking forward to see you at the Southwest Chocolate and Coffee Festival in April. Frank, absolutely. Everybody, I'm going to be there. I'm giving 4 classes over 2 days. So do 2 pairing classes on Saturday, 2 pairing classes on Sunday. I may be involved in an event for the chocolate exhibitors on Friday evening. So pay attention if you're going to be there. If you're a consumer, I'll put links in it. Hopefully I can get, if there's a discount ticket link, I will be able to let members of the Chocolate Life or watchers of Pod Safe Chocolate, you'll be able to get those. Just one thing, tomorrow, which is the first Saturday of February, and this is a national holiday which is always observed on the first Saturday of February. Tomorrow is National Ice Cream for Breakfast Day. So if you want to celebrate the holiday, go support your local artisanal chocolate store. Chances are they're open early. My daughter works for a Midwest chain, and she's going to be at the store they're opening up hours early tomorrow morning so that people can go out and celebrate chocolate for breakfast, or ice cream for breakfast, on National Ice Cream for Breakfast Day, which has been around since the 1960s, as I understand. Founded by somebody originally from Rochester, New York, who wanted something interesting to do on a dreary, snowy Saturday morning for children and grandchildren. So I think that's the story about how it came to be. And then I also want to let everyone know that this coming Tuesday, um, my guest is going to be Dustin Cornett. Dustin is the founder of the Craft Chocolate Challenge. We're going to be talking about the 2024 edition of the Craft Chocolate Challenge. How many entries there are, what the entries, how much time there is in order to be able to enter into the awards. So we're going to go over the status of this year's entries. And then we're also going to be talking about a new project, which is the Midwest Craft Chocolate Festival, which is going to be held mid-November. And so Dustin and I will be talking about it as well. So, all right, I want to thank everybody who's made it all the way to the end. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, subscribe, right? Click on the notification bell so that you will be notified of each episode of Pod Safe Chocolate. Do them on Tuesdays, do them on Fridays, starting 10 o'clock Mountain Standard Time, but you will get a notification if you click that subscribe bell. Like the video here on YouTube. Share it if you want on LinkedIn, on Facebook with your friends so that they join. And if you're not a member of thechocolatelife.com, you can go to the Chocolate Life, click on the join button. There's always a free membership. But because I don't take ads, I'm not doing a Patreon. All of the support that I get to do these episodes is through premium memberships on the Chocolate Life. So please consider supporting the work that I do that way. And with that, we're at an end for today's episode. Right? And I'm going to close out. Hopefully you got the sense that this whole topic about communicating and articulating flavor is one that I'm excited about, one that interests me, and one that I have a lot of fun with. And that's what I want to remind everybody. If you're working with chocolate and you are not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Until the next time.